How can I bulletproof my deal in today's market? That's what we're going to cover today on Mondays with Mike. I'm Mike. For those who may be, those of you who may be joining for the first time, we've covered this topic before. So for those of you who've been watching us for years, this may sound familiar. But every market is a little bit different, and the threats to your deal can change over time. It depends on the factors, right? So I'm going to try to take it from what I think is the most relevant and highest threat down to what is a minimal threat. So right now, appraisals or under appraising is a big problem. CoreLogic is reporting that nationwide, I believe in August of this year, which is the last data they had available, 13% of appraisals came in lower than the contract price. So without spending too much time on that, essentially, if you're not familiar with this concept, if there's a mortgage contingency on a deal, and the bank sends their appraiser in, and the appraiser thinks that the value is actually less than what the buyer, their borrower, has agreed to pay, very likely, and it depends on how much of a down payment there is, whether the buyer qualifies for the mortgage amount using different program or a different ratio. But let's just keep it simple. In all likelihood, they're going to say, look, if you qualified for 90% of the purchase price, well, now we're only going to lend you 90% of the appraised value, which is lower. And we have this gap right here between my hands. All right, so how do you make up for that? Well, the buyer can put more cash in, the seller can lower the price, or maybe you meet in the middle, but the deal can die because it's part of the mortgage contingency. So this is a big issue, and I'm just looking at the numbers. I believe we're down, actually. CoreLogic had this clocked at 19.7% of deals under appraising in May of this year. The norm, according to CoreLogic, we last saw in January at 7.3%. These are national figures, of course, but it's definitely affecting us here on Long Island. And anytime you have heavy appreciation in home values, it takes a while for the appraisers to catch up. So what can you do to prevent this? Well, a lot of it depends. If you have a buyer who has cash that they can put into a deal, and when you're vetting them, if you're the listing agent, you would want to address this up front. If you identify certain cash that could be put into the deal, you can build into the contract that there's, if they have the ability and their attorney's willing to do it, that they're just going to waive that appraisal portion of the mortgage contingency. So no matter where it appraises, they're going to make up the difference with cash. More likely, you can come up with something like maybe a $10,000 difference or less. They'll make up for it in cash. And then beyond that, the contingency applies. They may be able to walk away. Or you may be able to put it back together. But you want to plan ahead of time, and we were getting those kinds of concessions from buyers in the bidding war days of the spring and summer. Now it's a little trickier. You have to really have a little bit of a frenzy going in order to get a buyer to agree to backstop the appraisal, as I like to say. What else? So inventory, another issue that we're dealing with, and I've talked about this in weeks past. But here I'm talking about inventory as it applies to your seller. So a lot of times we have these chains, right? We have a seller who is waiting for their buyer to close, and the buyer is waiting to sell to their buyer, and so on and so forth. Well, there hasn't been a lot of inventory really anywhere in the country relative to where we've seen in the recent past. So you want to make sure ahead of time that everybody has their game plan together. If your seller is planning to look once they're in contract, well, I hope they're pre-approved, and I hope you're helping them, or whoever's helping them is hitting the ground running, and that there's a contingency plan. They have some place that they can stay if they don't have that house lined up, because it can be very difficult with all the timelines, especially if there's financing involved at different legs. Inventory, you really just have to know what you're in for, plan ahead, and hustle to get them into their house and to have it all line up. Interest rates becoming potentially a factor again. We've been seeing interest rates ticking up. It has a lot to do with the global economy and the Fed and just what's going on. I've covered that a little bit too, but interest rate locks, which when rates were ever going down, maybe weren't as much of an issue, those are going to come back again, and people are going to be really concerned if their rate lock is going to expire. most contracts of sale do not cover a rate lock expiration. So this happens all the time where a buyer is running at the end of their rate lock and they say, well, the seller is delaying in closing. That they have to cover me, right? They have to pay for my extension. Probably not. You definitely want to check with your attorney or whoever's involved. But in all likelihood, that could be at risk, and it could be very expensive day for day to extend that. So you want to plan that out. And the best advice I have here, because we can't control what happens with interest rates, everybody needs to be on the same schedule. So in lower New York, at least where I am, you have 2 lawyers. A lot of times we have 2 realtors. We have a banker. There could be title closers that have to line up for closing, bank attorneys. Everybody really needs to be made aware of what the target is. And if the rate lock getting blown may blow the financing, if rates are that much higher than where they were when the borrower started, it's not going to be so easy as the seller to say, well, it's not my problem. Fighting over the down payment that's left over is not as good as closing and getting the money that was agreed to. All that time off the market is lost. Another issue that is not specific to this market, but just is always an issue. Do you have all your permits? Is the building file in order? When they pull the title report and the municipal search, will the buyer's lawyer find all the certificates of occupancy and closed out permits in place for what's in the house? Well, if you're not sure, because a lot of the towns have been closed or they've had limited access, if you're not sure what's in the building file, you should really make sure you're protected for just it's as is. And it's a leverage thing. If you can get your buyer to accept that, all the better. Some of the towns, like Town of Hempstead, I was there earlier this week. They've opened up again. It was maybe like a half-hour wait to get a building search. Some of the other towns, I think it's even in good times, it can be a little tricky to get those files. But know what you're in for and be conservative with it if you're not sure. Don't base it on what the tax assessor has on file or My Nassau Property. It doesn't always match up. They're not the same file. So last and least, I was going to say last but not least, employment. I mean, that's always the big X factor right alongside the appraisal, right? Once you're in contract, you've got the borrower column. The banker should have already checked their income, assets, their credit, and hopefully told them not to go buy that new car to affect their credit. And then you've got, the collateral. Those are like the 2 files I like to think of. Bankers, would probably call them something different. But once you've got the appraisal out of the way, well, what's left? What can jeopardize the commitment? Borrower or buyer losing their job. It can happen. Now, why do I say this is the least of the worries now? Well, if you're watching the news, the unemployment rate has ticked down, and in fact, there's a surge in job openings. It's actually getting harder for employers who are ramping up or business owners who are ramping up post-pandemic to fill those spots. So, I mean, does that mean that your buyer, if you're a seller, is bulletproof? There's no such thing as bulletproof. That was just the headline for this video. Somebody can always do something dumb or illegal and get fired. Or they may be a business owner. This is not a one-size-fits-all, but this is where the vetting comes in always. Is it a union-protected job? How long have they been working? If they're a small business owner, how confident is the banker in what the picture looks like right now? Because, the economy may be booming and people may be, passing over job opportunities because they can start their own business. It doesn't mean that the numbers are going to bear out and that they're going to be able to qualify. So a lot of this, the overarching theme is be prepared and know going into the deal what these pitfalls are and try to implement as many of these, we'll just call them hedging strategies, but I guess you could say bulletproofings as you can. And one that didn't really fit neatly as a solution for any of these specifically, but is worth noting, the amount of the down payment that's put up at contract. So, let's say you're putting 20% down, that's your down payment. Well, there's a certain portion of that will be put up at contract. And sometimes that's also referred to as the down payment. I like to call it the contract deposit because it's a little bit easier to understand. That portion of the buyer's down payment that's held in escrow, in Lower New York, it's the seller's attorney typically that holds that. That's the skin in the game. And I don't know about in other places, but where we are on Long Island, if that down payment amount is too small and you have to fight about it, if the deal falls apart, sellers often think, well, I have the down payment. And maybe it's a 30,000 down payment. Let's say I'm gonna get to keep that, and there's no way they'll walk away from it. They'll move heaven and earth to close, or at least I'll be compensated 30,000 for my lost time in the market. Well, buyers will fight you to get that down payment back, and if the down payment is too small relative to what the litigation costs would be, are you really going to want to fight about it? Because it's going to diminish the pot for both parties, and you may need to get a new lawyer. Real estate lawyers who do residential transactions, they're not necessarily in the business of litigating on these contract disputes, and it can get drawn out, and it can be sent over to the courts to be held while it's in controversy. And you may have a lot less left over than you think if you don't settle quickly. But keep that in mind. You may need to settle for a lesser amount. And, I would say, it's less common to see the 10% of contract, at least in Nassau County these days. But that is kind of still the gold standard as far as I'm concerned. And in New York City, I still see it far more often. That is typically enough money for everybody to take it very seriously. And for a seller who's even just settling for a portion of it to be compensated for time off the market. All right, speaking of time. This is going long. Wow, it's another 12 minutes plus. What can I say? I apologize, but I guess you could have hit stop if you weren't intrigued. Thank you as always for watching. We'll bring you some more content. I'm going to try to vary the content even more going forward, and I hope everybody has a great rest of October. If I'm not on before then, happy Halloween.